welcome everyone that's joined us today for our webinar to talk about the effect of tariffs on individual businesses and entities out there. I'm Dennis Schooley. I'm going to be taking you through the various slides that we're going to review and talk about things. We absolutely welcome questions, so that if you do have questions, I would ask that you just type them in the chat. We're going to deal with all the questions at the end, so I'm going to try to go through the presentation, and then Mike DeBoer is with me as the moderator here, and he's going to sort of vet the questions, make sure they all make sense, and he'll submit them at the end to me, and we'll answer them one at a time. And if we don't have time to get to all of them on screen here, we'll certainly respond to any questions that we don't get on. But with that, please just type in the chat if you've got a question, and we'll address them all at the end. Okay, so we're going to talk about tariffs and what's going on in our world today. And as we know, it's kind of topsy-turvy. I mean, some are on again and off again and those sorts of things. And that makes it even more challenging for business people when, in fact, things are changing all the time with legislative changes and negotiations between countries and things like that. And it really means that it's even more imperative to gain control of your business. And that's really what we're going to try to talk about today is how do you do that a little bit and mitigate some of the effects that if you've got some negative economic effects from these tariffs. So first of all, I just want to talk about some of the trends that happen because of tariff implications, and certainly decreased sales can be one of them. I mean, buyers are reducing their purchases because costs are higher, and so that's a real effect. And now sometimes it's because there's an actual increase in sales that they will reduce their purchases, but then other times they'll reduce just as a fear of increases that are coming up, so they'll adjust their buying policies, and that certainly can affect your business. Another thing is certainly decreased margins. I mean, if the market pressures don't give you the ability to raise your prices, then as costs of your direct inputs increase, your margin is going to go down. So the effect is still the same. There's a negative effect on profit margins. And then, of course, sometimes there's delayed purchases because people are just thinking that this is going to go away. So this too shall pass, as I said on the screen there. And what that results in is increased carrying costs for your inventory because it's not flowing out at the normal turn you might be used to. So those are some negative effects. Then, of course, some of the reactions that we have related to anticipated or real decreases in profitability or increases in costs is the fact that we may decrease staff. And that's a reactive measure that, we tend to, as people, react in a negative way when these things are sort of topsy-turvy with the economy. And often that's counterproductive. And really our own actions propagate the fears and they become a reality because of our actions. But it still is a real effect of what's going on with the tariffs or the fears of tariffs that are happening each and every day. And then, of course, there's decreased evaluations for companies. Like we've seen in public companies, stock prices have declined over the last 3 or 4 months. And, in private companies, it's an EBITDA decrease or, that it makes it more difficult in an equity sale, whether that's, part of the company or the whole company, it just makes it more difficult. So that's another effect with tariffs. And then I'm just going to mention there's sort of specific effects on nonprofits or charities as well. I mean, a lot of times the goods or services that nonprofit, that charity has to have in order to deliver programs has gone up, and that puts the handcuffs on them a little bit. And it also means when there's uncertainty out there, those corporate donations, those personal donations that charities and nonprofits sort of thrive on, they will be reduced because the companies and the people themselves have their own doubts and their own concerns. And so, that becomes a threat to the services and programs for nonprofits and charities, and also may scale back initiatives that would be beneficial for future services and programs for their constituents. So all of that is sort of the negative effect. I mean, the paradox of that is that in a difficult time, the demand for services increases. But at the same time, there's the inability to deliver at the same level as in the past. So whether that's food or shelter or other programs, the need is higher, and yet the ability to provide is lower. So all those are sort of, I mean, I'm certain there's other effects of tariffs for sure. I just wanted to give sort of a quick summary of, what's happening out there for some businesses and some charities. So what can I do about it? Well, the major thing to get is a mindset, and that is in every difficulty, there is certainly an opportunity to outstrip competition, because most people will just sort of freeze in spot when something is really topsy-turvy in the government or the economy or in the business environment, that sort of thing. So, what that really means is that there's an opportunity to move forward when everyone else is sort of stuck in neutral or maybe even in reverse. And, that's been proven time after time after time when we've seen in the past with recessions or with, inflation, pandemic, tariffs. They're all sort of the same thing. They're really non-controlled causal circumstances that create an ability to act or react. And when we react or when we freeze, that's maybe not the best action. But when we can act positively in a difficult time, usually we're able to get ahead of our competition because we're doing something they're not doing. I'm going to get a little more specific as we go through this after I sort of lay out the groundwork here. So Gartner Group, they had some recommendations in a recent white paper that they went through. Now they're kind of general, but they boiled it down to three things. And one is assess tariff risk impact. Well, that's fairly common advice. I mean, make sure you assess what's going on related to the tariffs, and that really means be proactive and make sure you are understanding how they might affect you and sort of map things out, and then prepare to navigate, which is a plan for various circumstances. And then the third piece they said was to make sure you engage in proactive scenario analysis. In other words, what ifs in various circumstances, and they're just suggesting you need to do that in relation to the changing economic environments that you may be facing. So, okay, so that's pretty general stuff. So mitigation, I'm going to mention, I guess, I'm not going to talk about too much, the first two, but I'm going to talk about three main areas of your income statement, which can be addressed related to the challenges that we see as business people today. First of all, revenue. We talked about that a little bit. Secondly, margins. That's the control of your direct input costs. And then the third one is those things below that gross margin line, the operating expenses, those everyday things that I'm probably going to spend more time on that than anything else as we continue through the webinar. So, and again, the three main areas: revenue, margins, and operating expenses below the gross margin line. So on the revenue side, and really this is your bailiwick, this is your business, you know this better than anybody else. I can't really give a whole lot of advice related to that, but things to think about, of course, are, can I diversify my markets? Are there other markets out there, maybe, internally or maybe outside the country, whatever it might be, but it's obviously something that we should be thinking about when our revenues are threatened by something that we can't control. I mean, or can you find a pricing model that maybe fits the economic environment today, but still adds to your profitability? Maybe it's not the same rate, the same margin, whatever it might be, but there may be alternatives and you need to think through it and be proactive about thinking through it. And then can your go-to-market tactics be improved? I mean, the way you've done things or maybe always done things or are doing things right now, maybe there's a way to readdress that. Can I come up with a different strategy or a different tactic to get to market that maybe mitigates some of these negative things? Or are you simply boxed in? And that's just the way it is. That doesn't mean you can't mitigate some of the effects of it, but it does mean you need to understand what your alternatives are. So then on the margin side, I mean, can you work with your supply chain and can they provide support? I mean, presumably they're having similar effects because of the tariffs and the changing economic environment, but maybe their understanding is a little bit deeper as well, and they may be able to provide temporary relief or some kind of plan that's got, a delay in some of the pricing increases they might have had or whatever it might be, but work with the supply chain. Can you increase your productivity? That's obviously a way that you can increase your margins as well. And that can be, labor productivity. Is that something I can address? Process improvements. Are there better ways to do things I do right now with my direct inputs or my manufacturing or my creation of ability to sell something? And then are there alternative inputs? Because maybe not all things are affected equally by the tariffs. And so those are just some really general comments about revenue and margin management. But again, like I said, that's your bailiwick. That's what you know better than I could ever know. But what I want to emphasize is maybe the real opportunity in our world today lies in that third area. This is going to be the focus of the remainder part of the webinar. So, this is what I always call death by 1,000 cuts, and those less than primary expenses, all those things that are happening below the gross margin line that can be very complicated or very complicated. And so really the point here, though, is, each dollar saved below that gross margin line is a dollar added directly to your bottom line or directly to your EBITDA. And of course, the value when you add it to EBITDA, if you're looking at, capital sale or sale of the business or whatever is then times the multiplier in your industry. It's certainly a big benefit if you can cut dollars down in those costs below the gross margin line. So I want to talk about that a little bit, and really that's where my concentration is going to be here. So the question to you as a business person is, okay, what additional resources do I need or can I put in play to manage these ancillary expenses? You have to determine, is there an ROI? And you're the only one that can determine that. Should you add staff to do this? Should you reallocate staff to do it? Is it worth implementing certain protocols to manage these expenses? You can answer that question by doing a proper analysis. So, the thing is, what you're trying to determine in all these different expenses is, are there billing errors in your invoices? Is that things that I can recover with the application of a proper process or time? Do you have redundant services or products? Are there optimal prices for all items? And that's sort of on an item by item and month after month basis because things change continually. These are sort of the things you need to look at where you can really put some dollars back into your bottom line. Are there better methods of operation below the gross margin line? And that kind of has to be done on a expense by expense basis and ask these questions about every single expense. Is there something that's happening that I didn't really pay attention to or even realize was happening? But when I ask the right questions and isolate it by expense item, you might be surprised what you can sort of set aside that you can maybe manage. And then what tactics are they to optimize those things? And what alternatives are there? Are there different services or different products? Or are there add-ons that maybe allow me to manage that expense better? Or is there a different process that can be put in place that's a better way than the way I've always done things? And then is each stream being handled as it should be? It's when you isolate each of these individual expenses, which can be, in the dozens below that gross margin line, and you think through it in a logical way that you can maybe identify ways that you can cut back on your costs and still maintain your operations as they should be maintained and still add to your bottom line. So that's what we're going to sort of focus on now. And then, of course, the usage of each of these different things, and that's whether you feel it's advantageous and intelligent to put management controls in place for the usage of whatever it is you're going to look at, each line on that below the gross margin expense list sort of thing. Some of those things you have to determine, is that good for my business? Is that good for morale? Is it going to affect my employee productivity? Or is this just good cost control, so I should do it? There's never a linear look at these things without considering, the nonlinear effects. So I'm just saying you do have to put some thought into it, though. That's really the issue. So the difficulties, is my staff time better spent concentrating on those first two items, revenues and margins? Or does it make sense to put some staff time aside to do these things? So the true understanding of these individual expenses does require a lot of study and a lot of research and that's what I'm going to try to go into here a little bit to try to indicate what you need to be looking for in these different expense categories because they truly are very complex. And just at a first blush isn't really going to do anything for you to really get at improving your bottom line. So can you establish tools to analyze these expenses properly? And that may prove insurmountable because the establishment of those tools, maybe you got to buy them, maybe you got to program them, maybe you've got to determine if there's even alternatives out there, but thinking about it and determining if there are or if there aren't is really the challenge here. And then you have to decide, is that something I should do or is it not worth it? And that's where it comes back to that ROI. Only you can determine, is it worth my investment to make this happen? But it should involve, and this is more my advice than anything else, monthly reviews of all of these things. That means their invoices, the contracts, the vendors, and I'm talking about each individual expense line here. If you can put a protocol in place to do this thing, look at the invoice and the contracts and the vendors, all the market options, determine if there's price creep in my bills or errors in my bills. If you can do that on a regular basis, you're going to find some money and it's going to go right to your bottom line, as I said before. Now, that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. I don't mean that at all. Do you have software to identify errors in past invoices? Most people don't, but can you establish that? Or a system to identify those errors? Is there an ROI for my staff to properly learn, to gain expertise or mastery in each of these expense categories? Again, I'm going to point out some of the things that they will need to know in several of the different cost categories, and you can determine, is that something I can achieve or not? and then focus on the ones where you can really sort of attack it and get value for yourself. So do you have or can you establish a system to stay abreast of pricing options that are out there, not just what your own vendor has right now, but the entire marketplace? What vendors are capable of providing me with what I need? What technologies are out there now that I may not have thought about in the past or are coming down the pike in the very near future? What are the market trends that may make changes in all of these areas that I should be aware of if I'm going to manage this properly? What legislative adjustments are out there, because that kind of stuff happens all the time. And most times we're very reactive to legislative adjustments rather than understanding when they happen and what I need to change as they happen. So the people that stay on top of that are the ones that really mitigate the loss of dollars through leakage down the drain when they don't realize it's happening. So, and then, maybe there's some adjustments in your business that have happened or will be happening that need adjusted solutions. So again, I'm trying to give you a sort of a protocol, an objective protocol to go through and think about each one of these individual expenses and find if you can find some small savings in each one. Because, and I just going to address a book here written by James Clear called Atomic Habits. It's been a very popular, millions of copies have been sold, but it's more of a personal management book than anything else, but certainly some of his theories and thoughts apply to business too. And one of his main theorems is if you can improve 1%, something, anything, 1% each day, in the long run, even at the end of the year, you're going to have a huge increase. So, or increase in your own capabilities, in your own profitability in the case of a business, in your own effectiveness. So the question is, what can you improve by 1% today, and then 1% tomorrow, and then that accumulates from there on top of each other. So I just wanted to make that point, and that's really the thought process I'm trying to sort of mention or teach here. And a lot of that comes down to negotiation skills. If you're going to look at these individual expenses on a one-by-one basis, how can I negotiate better with these vendors? And that comes from a place of understanding, of course. So you've got to understand how all these things work, the marketplace, all those things I just mentioned. But negotiation skills are learnable. There's courses out there. Udemy, that's just a web-based sort of teaching platform. There's others as well. There's podcasts, there's books, there's articles, there's websites, there's links. The whole point is anything you want to learn today is accessible. So it's a matter of, do you have the resources, or should you allocate the resources to have either yourself or your staff members learn better negotiation skills? I mean, that's what we do at our company. We do that for sure. We're always trying to increase our negotiations capabilities and really have a commitment to lifelong learning. I mean, that's a pretty general comment, but I think pretty much every business should have that. So right now, I'm going to take just a little step back, just have a little bit of fun here. Now, there's a reason in this, but I'd like to get a volunteer. So if one of you could put up your hand, there's a little yellow hand in the software. Mike will see that, and he'll just unmute you. So I just it's a very easy thing, guys. There's no real big test to this. So if I could get a volunteer, that would be great. So Mike, you let me know when we got a volunteer.
Looks like Julie is able to volunteer.
Okay, Julie. Okay.
Oh no, actually, Bob Fisher has raised his hand.
So. Okay, Bob. Sorry, Julie, you're out. Bob, you're my volunteer. This is a very simple thing, Bob. So I've just got a couple questions for you. You play cards. You know what a deck of cards looks like. So in a deck of cards, we've got red and we got black cards. Pick one of those two colors for me, Bob.
Red.
Okay, that's right. Okay, so in the red cards, we've got hearts and we've got diamonds, right? So pick one of those two suits, hearts or diamonds.
Diamonds.
Okay, so in the diamonds, we've got small cards and we got big cards, right? We've got ace through 10, let's say that's the small group, and the face cards are the big group. So pick one of those two groups, the small one or the big one, please.
Small.
The small one. So that leaves me with the big cards. So in the big diamonds, I've got the jack, the queen, and the king of diamonds, right? Pick one of those cards.
The king of diamonds.
And that leaves me with the queen and the jack of diamonds, right? So pick one of those two, the jack or the queen of diamonds.
Jack.
And that leaves me with the queen of diamonds. Now I'm hoping you can see my screen because I just turned over the queen of diamonds.
Certainly can, yep.
Okay. So how did I do that? Other than I'm magic, but how did I do that? Okay, let me explain how I did that, because most of you are going, what is he doing and what is he talking about? Well, what I want to talk about here is in negotiations, which is what we started to talk about here a minute ago, a lot of how you're going to negotiate is about asking questions of the people that you're going to negotiate with, whether that's a vendor or anybody else. The same thing applies in a sales scenario as well. Well, anybody that's been ever coached or trained or educated about question asking has always been told to make sure you ask open questions, those W questions, the who, what, why, where, when. The reason for that, and it's good teaching, is the fact that when you ask a question like that, people will tell you their story. They'll give you more information from which you can then react or continue to negotiate. But what I just did with Bob was I asked him a whole series of closed questions. I asked him black or red. He said red, so I said yes. If he would have said black, I would have said that leaves red for me. See, I'm in red no matter what, because I asked him a closed question. He only had two choices. No matter what he chooses, I'm going where I want to go. But he said red, so I said yes. Okay, he said diamonds, so I said yes. But if he had said hearts, I would have said that leaves me the diamonds. So I'm in the diamonds no matter what. So then Bob said small, so I said that leaves me the big one. So I'm in the big diamonds. And you see how I just eliminated it down so that I can lead him to the queen of diamonds no matter what he says to me. So my point in all this, guys, is other than having just a little bit of fun, is that closed questions have a real good place in good negotiations as well, because you can direct the sort of the subject area using closed questions and then ask your open questions to do your negotiation. So anyway, that's just a little bit of fun that I add into this presentation. So anyway, with that, what I want to do is talk, and you really do want to get to those open questions, and certainly learning the closed questions that you're going to use in a negotiation. It's not as easy as a finite set of cards, which I can direct that fairly easy. But the whole point here is if you think about closed questions I can ask to direct the conversation and then ask my open questions, you're gonna negotiate better, is my whole point. Okay, so what I want to do here now is talk about some of these individual expenses that are in fact below the gross margin line. So I'm just going to go through a few examples here and talk to you about what it is you should be looking for and why it is so confusing and why there's so much opportunity there, really. So in telecom, for example, that's an area that's rife with errors in the invoices. As a matter of fact, there are studies that have shown that 98% of errors in telecom bills are in the favor of the telecom company. Now, I'm not going to suggest to you that they're doing it on purpose, because I would never suggest such a thing. But I will say this: when the error is not in their favor, they certainly fix it awfully quickly. When it is in their favor, well, maybe it doesn't get fixed so quickly. It just hangs around. They kind of look at it as a revenue source, quite frankly, because when they fix it, okay, that's fine. Everybody's being billed properly. But in the meantime, people are being overbilled. Some will notice, some will not. Those that notice, the telecom companies are going to negotiate like heck to keep as much as they can and give back only part. That's where you have to be strong and tough and realize what you can get back from those errors in your invoices, because they're really rife throughout those invoices. There's over provisioning is very common in telecom as well. Over the decades, ever since it's been deregulated back in the 40s or 50s of the 1900s, the vendors out there will sell whatever a business or a nonprofit will buy. Whatever you think you need, they're going to tell you need it. And there's nothing nefarious. It's really just capitalism. But regardless of that, the result is that over time, so many companies get over provisioned, they don't even realize they are. They're just paying for stuff and they don't need it, don't want it, didn't even realize they had it in some cases. So the other part of this is there's multitudes of vendors. And the challenge here is you should be tracking them, and not just the ones you use, but the entire marketplace, because that's where the opportunities may lie. Now, I'm not suggesting you're going to go around changing telecom vendors all the time, because that can become a little, burdensome and difficult and challenging, but it should be part of what you look at, because sometimes it is worth that change, or at least worth bringing that market to bear on your existing vendors. So you have to track them and understand what the offerings are. And then the pricing options that are out there, they're not transparent. Maybe they're not even readily available unless you really know how to push for them and you can find out. But can you find out? That's the question for yourself. So again, I'm trying to give you sort of a step-by-step, sort of a rote method of analyzing these expenses on a one-by-one basis. And then, of course, there's changing options. And that's almost monthly in this world, and you need to stay on top of those changing options, whether that's technology or pricing platforms or specials of the month or whatever it might be. And oftentimes the vendors are trying to get rid of something because they're going to the next thing. So it can be either going redundant or it's well priced for something that you need. So again, understanding all of that and staying on top of that can be really beneficial. And then of course you need to ask the question, in some things, should I be bundling or unbundling? In some cases, bundling is the best option. In other cases, unbundling and doing it item by item or cost by cost is the best thing. So you just really got to figure that out. And all of this is based on, years ago, we dubbed this as a science perpetrated by the telecom companies, and we call it confuseology. It's almost on purpose, where those invoices and those contracts and the marketplace is so confusing, nobody can really understand what it is except the telecom providers themselves. And then price creep's really common in this world as well. And it's not easily identified, and it takes initiative to really make sure that nothing changed. And when we talk about price creep, we're talking about 50 cents here and $1 there and $1.50 there, that sort of thing. And to give you an example, one of our own cost categories in our business, for example, this is what was happening. It was like $1, $1.50, that kind of thing. Well, I didn't notice that in our bills. We didn't notice that in our bills. But when we look back at the end of the year, it was 18% that the prices had increased by these small creeps. So you've really got to be on top of that, because it multiplies upon itself when a price creep gets in there. So you have to be careful you stay on top of that as well. And really the whole question is there a more rapidly changing world than telecom? But staying on top of it, there's money there. And what I'm saying is, in confusion, there's certainly an opportunity. And that really applies to all these costs that I'm going to talk about. So that's what I'm going to sort of mention in telecom in terms of how you should be viewing it, how you should be analyzing it, things you should be cognizant of and be able to stay on top of or track. Okay, so now let's talk about merchant services. Now, this would be only if you accept credit cards or debit cards, okay? The thing here, and almost no one realizes, that there are in excess of 700 different pricing buckets when you accept credit cards or debit cards. And it's really difficult to understand what they all are. And what it really boils down to, and again, most people don't really even know this, but there's different prices for the same card, depending on whether you tap it, swipe it, insert it, give it over the phone, or give it over the internet. Those all indicate different pricing practices that merchant services provider will do. And then, is it a cashback or a points or an air miles or a rewards card? That also creates this big matrix of more than 700 pricing buckets. Okay, and so it's not only knowing all the pricing buckets, but then understanding, how do I optimize my processing environment? Am I doing it the right way? So all those things kind of tie into what I just said. And then the other thing that's really challenging is the fact that these 700 rates, they can change every April and every October. Well, I mean, that's certainly not going to be your main focus in your business. But if you're trying to assign someone to really understand how merchant services works, they're going to have to figure this out and stay on top of this if they're going to optimize, because it's a rapidly changing world, twice a year minimum. Okay. And then the other part is, you've probably run into this if you do accept credit cards or debit cards. There's hundreds, thousands, quite frankly, of sales reps. They're everywhere, right? And there's multitudes of vendors for merchant services. And that's because there's margin in it for them. They can make a lot of money by providing these services to businesses. And then there's this other thing. This may not apply to all of you, but there are certainly certain parts of our world and businesses and verticals where the vendor will marry, which I mean integrate, their solution to software that you need to operate your business. So the merchant vendor will make a deal with the software provider where their merchant solution, meaning their ability to accept credit cards through themselves for you, it only is the only solution for this software. At least that's what they tell you. And so you feel that I can't change merchant vendors because it's a part of my software, it's included. Well, that's not, I mean, it may be true. I'm not saying it's false, but it doesn't mean it will be your only alternative forever. There's something called connectors, and there are means to do this where you've got to hire a programming team to do it, or people that understand how to do it, but they can devise a connector so that your software can actually work with other merchant providers. So little known to you that's an option out there. And it's not real easy, but I just want to make sure that you do know that it is an option, you know. And the point I'm making here, if there are, I wrote hundreds on the slide, there's really thousands of sales reps out there, which means they're all earning commissions by getting you or anyone else to join their processing company. Well, if there's commissions being paid to thousands of people, that means there's room within the pricing model, okay? Because those commissions have to go to those people and they still have to make a profit as a company. So that's a pretty good indication that there's room, okay? So that's, again, merchant services is one of those things that really should be looked at very closely. Okay, now let's talk about courier services. Whether you use that or whether you don't, this will be applicable to you. This can be very confusing as well. Now, I think we all know that there's a lot of things that go into the pricing of a particular courier package, but I just want to go over that fairly quickly so you can see what it really means. So, I mean, obviously the distance it has to travel, and that's done on a zone-by-zone basis through both the United States and Canada, and you know, that's going to be one factor that goes into the price. And then how quickly does it have to get there? And there's a lot of options there. Is it overnight by 9 a.m. tomorrow? Is it anytime tomorrow? 2 days, ground? And there's other options as well. Of course, the quicker, the more expensive it is. The further it has to go, the more expensive it is. Then there's something called actual weight versus dimensional weight. And what that means is, okay, there's a price. As things get heavier, it's going to cost more because I need more handling from my driver. It takes more gas to get a heavier thing there, that sort of thing. But then, is it a small package of steel, which is based on actual weight, or is it a huge box of ping pong balls? Because that might take half a truck. So they're going to price your package on whichever is more. So you need to kind of understand what both of those are and really think about your packaging as well, because maybe you can package something a little better so it's either less dimension or less weight. I don't know, but those are things that are going into your price for that package. And then how frequent to similar destinations? And I'll get to how that applies in a minute or so, but that's something you really have to look at when you're looking at negotiating better courier services. And then there's fuel charges, which they change every week. You know, that's a volatile market, which maybe you don't have much control over that, but understanding that's part of what the formula is really important. And then there's something called accessorial charges, and that's all these other things that could be added on. Sometimes you don't even realize what you're paying for. But, you know, do you need a signature on the other end? Is it off their normal pickup or delivery route? You know, does it have to go to a residential spot or somewhere off the route? Or do you need a payment at the end? Or how's it packaged? And if they don't like it, they're going to repackage it and charge you something. All these things go into what's called accessorial charges. And quite frankly, the pricing book for courier services is about an inch thick with all these different options described, and figuring out, if you know how read that book, you can kind of figure out what my package would be, what it would cost if you're going to go into, say, the UPS store. That's what it would cost, okay? But then in a business, you should have what's called a pricing agreement. So, and that's a series of discounts, and they're provided to pretty much every business. Fact is, if you don't have a pricing agreement, you absolutely should get one because you're being charged more than you need to be charged. I'll tell you that right now. But the discount book is not a simple thing either. It's about an inch thick as well, because they don't discount across the board. They discount by each individual item. So, you know, something from zone 1, zone A to zone F is this, and this discount, and 2 other zones is a different discount, and this weight is this discount. So it's really, really confusing, but it's nothing that you can't get a handle on if you really understand how the pricing book works and how the discount book works and analyzing it properly. So, you know, the other thing about this too in couriers, when you have a late delivery, you know, if you select one of the overnight or next day or whatever it might be, and it's not delivered on time, even if it's 2 minutes late from what you purchased, you're entitled to a refund. Now, the problem is you're only entitled to that refund if you apply for it and if you do it within 15 days. You know, FedEx and UPS are not coming up to your door and say, "Oh, sorry, we were late. Here's your, you know, $50 back." They don't do that. You got to apply for it. You got to do it within 15 days, which is very difficult because you got to stay on top of it. You got to isolate, you know, late shipments, and then you've got to fill out the forms to apply for the refund. Sometimes you think that's not even worth it, but it is if you put a proper process in place to identify them all, and you have an allocation of someone that can apply for those refunds. So, okay. Now, then we want to talk about waste a little bit here. Now, waste can be a lot of things. And what I'm talking about here is anything you would pay for to get rid of, okay? So that could be trash, it could be recycling, it could be hazardous, it could be medical, it could be sludge, porta potties, grease traps, construction debris, anything. So I'm not going to go with that. I mean, there's probably 50 different categories that can be looked at in terms of paying to get rid of something. So why is that so complex? And what do I have to get on top of to understand that? Well, you need to look at, first of all, what's the distance to the landfill or the disposal site from where you're disposing. So that's part of the pricing platform that vendor will include in their quote. Then, is it on the standard route of the vendor or not? And if I'm far off a standard route, then they're going to charge more. So you got to determine what that is. And then what's the size of the bin? And there's a lot of options there. You know, you've seen smaller bins behind a restaurant, for example, or maybe a huge 40-yard roll-off bin at a construction site, things like that. But determining the right size of the bin can really change your pricing option that you've got with that vendor. And then the frequency of removal. In other words, is it being removed too much, and therefore you're not using the bin optimally, or is it not being removed enough, and you're paying overage charges? By the way, overage charges, that's a well, I'm gonna list it down here, but just as an aside, that's something that's kind of tricky in this world sometimes, because you know, sometimes something will happen with the driver that's supposed to pick up your bin, for example. You know, they're sick, or their kid got sick, or they just stopped for 2 coffees instead of 1, and they miss your pickup. Okay. Well, you may not notice that. Your bin out back, is anybody looking at that all day to see if it got picked up when it was supposed to? You know, it's probably not being monitored as close as you want. But what happens there is, not only are you charged for a pickup that didn't happen, probably the next time they come to do a pickup, your bin's going to be overfilled and you're going to get overage charge. So you kind of get double whacked on the same problem that isn't even your problem. So you've got to take a look at that. The one way that you can do that, by the way, is that they are required to take pictures when they pick up the bins. So if you don't feel they picked it up, you can ask for a picture of the pickup. And if they can't prove it to you, you get a refund. And of course, then that negates the overage charge on the next pickup. Okay. So then what kind of waste stream is in that bin? You know, that's important too, because if you're putting the wrong stuff in the bin, maybe there's charges for hazardous when you shouldn't be getting them, or over, you know, you've just got to look at that stuff and see if your streams should be managed a little bit better within your business. And then what's the weight, the tonnage? Is there a fuel? There's always fuel surcharges, by the way. And again, that's going to be based on number one, the distance to the landfill is going to dictate a higher fuel surcharge. And then there might be landfill fees on top of that. And then these overage charges I just mentioned. And then there's extra costs in these things too. You know, are there wheels? Is there insurance? Are there locks? All those kinds of things. And maybe you're paying for something that's on your bin. You didn't even realize you had it and don't need it. So again, it's really a matter of setting these expenses aside on a one-by-one basis, understanding all the things that go into how you're being charged, determining if you can negotiate or change anything on a one-by-one basis. And you'll find that in the end, you're going to end up with some money back in your bank account where it belongs. Now, the other thing, well, a couple more things I want to talk about, supplies, for example, and there's all kinds of different types of supplies. There's facility supplies for cleaning and maintenance. You know, there's office supplies. We all know what those are. There's break room supplies, you know, whatever you've got in your break room to supply to your staff or your people. There's packaging supplies, you know, the boxes, the cups, the bags. Then there's shipping supplies, which are the, you know, the tape and the containers and the bubble wrap, all that sort of stuff. Medical supplies, masks, gloves, gauze, all that kind of stuff. So they're all sort of the same thing. They're being supplied by a vendor, by the company that gives you that stuff. Well, there's things that are involved with that can be negotiated or maybe not understood fully. So, you know, and these are things that are directly affected by the tariffs in a lot of cases, because some of these things are simply, you know, the price just went up by whatever percentage that the tariff is affecting that vendor, and that's coming right to you. You know, the other thing I'll say about all this too, and not just in the supplies area, but sometimes the vendors will use the tariffs as an excuse to add markup, maybe more than the tariff they're incurring, or maybe they're not really even incurring a tariff, but they're telling you they're, you know, you got to be really careful with that. Make sure that what you're being charged is not being overcharged based on an excuse called tariffs. Okay. So, you know, but markup is on top of that from the vendors. Of course, I mean, of course they're going to have a markup. They're in business to make money, but is it a fair markup? Is it something that you can negotiate? Then there's delivery costs, and that really is based on the frequency of delivery. So can you adjust that to maybe bring down the delivery cost? And then pack sizes as well. That affects it too. You know, am I buying pens in lots of 10 or lots of 100? Or is that cash needed and I should buy them in tens, but maybe that's more expensive per pen. You got to analyze all these things. And then there's a lot of additional costs that go into these things as well. So I just want to point all of that out in relation to supplies. Now, with software, again, there's things like license count versus required users. You know, lots of times we've got more licenses than we need, or we've got more features than we need on. And really, to analyze this properly, you've got to analyze it on a user by user by user basis to determine what features is each person using. Can I create a report to understand that, and then reduce the features on certain parts of this license that I'm buying for the software vendors? And then, of course, in a lot of cases, not all cases, but in some cases, you've got to estimate usage, you know, in buckets. You know, so are you estimating too much and paying for too big a bucket, or did you estimate too less, or too small, and now you're going to pay overages when you go over that? These are all things you need to consider when you're looking at SaaS, software as a service. Okay, and then there are pricing alternatives out there too through third parties rather than buying directly from, you know, Google or Microsoft or whoever it might be. And then one thing to look at too is redundancies. You know, do I have 3 licenses I'm paying for when in fact I could have just 1 license because they do the same darn thing, and it's really just based on employee preferences, but I can make some changes to bring that down. These are just things to be considered in the software area. Now, in less than truckload, which is really the next step up from courier, where courier services are usually those packages 150 pounds and less. So that's what we were talking about earlier. The less than truckload, that's when it's heavier than that. It's usually put on pallets and used in an actual, you know, freight truck, that kind of thing. So, and usually it's up to 6 pallets. If you go over 6 pallets, then you're using full freight load. We're not really going to talk about that here today. But the pricing in less than truckload is very similar to courier. It's just more because it's a bigger truck. So again, distance, how quickly, and there's lots of options there. There's one other thing here though goes into less than truckload, and that is it's a very arbitrary assessment by the less than truckload vendors that they just assign a category. It's kind of based on their assessment of risk of whatever they're shipping. You know, if it's steel, it's not too risky that it's going to break. If it's electronics, it's kind of risky, so there's a higher assessment. So that becomes something that's difficult to understand. And is it negotiable or not? You don't know till you ask, and you don't know till you pursue it. The other part of this, though, is that right now, as we speak, the industry is reassessing their methodology of doing these category assignments. So the whole thing's changing again. So again, it makes it very difficult for individual business people to stay on top of what should I have as a charge and what shouldn't I have. But it still is part of the deal. Okay. And then, of course, the same kinds of things as before: actual weight versus dimensional weight versus number of pallets, how frequently to similar destinations. Fuel surcharges are pretty significant here because we're talking about transport trucks, and they can change weekly, of course. There's a lot of vendors here. So, you know, in the courier world, it's a more limited set of vendors. In the less than truckload, it's hundreds, if not thousands, of vendors for less than truckload services. So that's a little difficulty. Now, the problem in this world too is they don't all sort of start at the same spot in their pricing model. So it's really more difficult to compare one vendor to another vendor to another vendor, even though you need to do that, and you should be doing that if you really want to optimize your pricing for getting your product shipped. So, and the other thing about this industry is there's very high discounts. They're common. So if you look at your bill and you're getting, let's say, an 85% discount, so you think, oh my God, how could I ever get better than that? You can't. Okay, that's common stuff. That's what they do. So if you went and did a 1 shipment on less than truckload and you haven't negotiated discounts because you're just doing 1 truck, you are going to pay through the nose. But if you've got a proper discount agreement with that vendor as a business, then you should have very high discounts on their standard pricing models. And that's what we're trying to point out here. So that's in that area. Now, there's a whole bunch of other things you can look at in the same vein. You know, there's fuel, electronic logging devices, fleet management, uniforms, payroll reduction, compressed gases, printers and copiers. All these things is really, they're the things that you should be looking at with the same methodology. And that's really the purpose of this webinar, is to try to point these things out, to give you a little guidance in terms of what you need to look at and how you look at it. Now, the additional part of all this is the vendor complexity that's out there. You know, in these categories, I mean, just the areas we examine in our business, for example, there's over 30,000 vendors. And how do you stay on top of all that? And yet that is our challenge as business people to stay on top. For example, telecom, there's 3,200 vendors plus. SaaS, there's over 10,000 vendors. Waste removal, over 9,000 vendors, etc. So that becomes part of the learning in terms of what you need to know in order to manage these things properly. So now, pricing is a lot of times not transparent either. I mean, contracts are complex. There's minimums in the contracts. You'd maybe not realize that you're getting charged a minimum when you didn't even use the amount of things you're being charged for. There's auto renewals. There's early termination fees. There's surcharges. There's other fees. These are all things that really you need to analyze in a proper, methodical way in order to make sure you're not paying what you should pay. And as I mentioned in a couple of the categories, errors are very prevalent, and you've got to find a way to identify those. And yet, I understand, and I know you're probably thinking, okay, but how can I do all this? Your resources are limited, and yet there is gold in those bills. And that's really the main message that we're trying to give here today. So the strategies that really you should be playing and the main are putting into play, and the main message is that you should be benchmarking regularly for each of these individual cost categories below the gross margin line. And you should be auditing your bills, not just the future or what's going on now this month, but looking at those past bills, determining what the future bills are going to look like, or those contracts that are going to generate those bills in the future. You should be looking at that. You should be determining, should I be unbundling or bundling? Should I be doing more at once or do it, one-offs? Those are all things that you need to look at as well. And it all comes down to analyzing the data that's in front of you, and with good tools. Some things that we hear all the time, and it really comes down to direct your vendors. Don't let them direct you. But we do hear all the time, well, I've got great vendors. There's no way I'm being overcharged, And how do you know that? Well, because I've got a great relationship. They bring me coffee. They're really nice to me. They visit me every quarter. There's a reason they're doing that. They're doing that to build a great relationship. And there's nothing wrong with that. We teach our people to build great relationships. And the reason is it does keep people beholden to that vendor that treats them well. And yet that doesn't mean for 1 second there isn't slough in the bills. That vendor's building that great relationship because they want to maintain that higher margin. That there's no fooling anybody here, right? So just realize that great relationship doesn't mean there might not be errors in your bills, and there might not be more margin that you don't need to pay. That vendor's not going anywhere anyway. Even if it's a great relationship, they're not going anywhere. They want your business. That's why they're putting effort and money into building that great relationship. Okay? So mitigating the effects of adverse conditions will take purposeful acts. And that's really my main message here. You can't, sitting back and hoping, that's the head in the sand approach. That's the join the herd methodology. We've got to fight that. We've got to fight the confirmation bias and group bias if we really want to be different and get that step up on our competitors. Confirmation bias, well, I believe this is the way it is, or I keep hearing it's all the same and I can't do much about it. Well, find out, put the effort in to determine, is that confirmation bias really what I should be fighting against and not just accepting it? Or the group bias, well, everybody's doing the same thing. So differentiate is where the profitability is. So, I guess the message is, what can you improve by 1% today? Is it your capability to manage these below the margin expenses, which can be very complicated for sure, but can you do that? And the return should be much more than 1%. If you do 1% improvement each and every day, that's a huge percentage increase in your overall profitability by the end of the year. So I know I went through a lot of that fairly quickly and kind of vaguely in a sense, but I do want to just open up for questions now. So Mike, I'm going to ask you to let me know what questions have come forward, and I'll see if I can answer them.
Sure, sounds good. Yeah, I've got a couple that have been sent in. So the first one is, which of these expenses should be attacked first?
Yeah, okay, well, that's going to really depend on each individual company, because each company is incurring different ones of these expenses at a higher rate than others. We've actually got a methodology here we call define the project. And what we mean by that is we're going to, and you have to ask yourself these questions, what is the highest volume cost? Maybe I start with that one. Or what's causing me the most pain? Or which vendors are most difficult? Or which one has the most impact on my operation? See, I can't give you a standard answer to that, because maybe in one business that's telecom. In another one, it might be waste. In another one, it might be fuel or compressed gases. So it's really not where I can say this one's the one you should attack for sure. You got to kind of look at your own business, ask all those questions in terms of volume and pain and vendors and impact, and then you can sort of determine. I don't mean to avoid the question, but I don't really think there's a linear answer to it.
Sure. Another one that came in, someone was just curious what it is that Schooley Mitchell actually does.
What do we do at Schooley Mitchell?
Yeah.
Okay, so we are a cost reduction consulting business, and what we do is really the things that I've been talking about here, suggesting that you can do some of it. And but what we do, I mean, our core service is actually pretty simple. What we do is we review, if you were a client of ours, we're going to review all these expenses that I talked about. We have 18 different cost categories actually, and we're going to take a look at them with all of these things in mind so that we can analyze them properly. And really, our audit is something that we do without a fee. Okay, and I'll explain that in a second. But when we do that, we do three basic things. One, we make sure you're being billed correctly. And if you're not, we get that money back for you and put it back in your bank account where it belongs. Secondly, we make sure you're not paying for things you don't need or want or even realize you had. And then thirdly, probably more important than the first two, is we do understand the whole marketplace. We have negotiated special prices with all kinds of vendors across North America, and we make sure our clients have that best pricing for the way that they do business. Now, two sort of important ways that we do it, like I mentioned, we do this on what's called a contingency basis, which means we don't charge our clients for the work that we do, the audit, the checking the bills, looking for errors. We don't charge anything for that at all. We only share in the savings we create. So basically what we do is we get money from the vendors, we give part of it back to our clients, and we keep part of it for the work that we do. But if we don't find any savings, there's no fee at all. The other thing that's really important about what we do is we do it on what's called an independent or objective basis, meaning we don't get paid by anybody, any vendors. We don't get commissions or kickbacks. We simply share in the savings we create for our clients. So we don't have a horse in the race is what it boils down to. So that's what we do.
Awesome. Other one that came in, Dennis, was our business would love to save money, but it can be a challenge to think about changing vendors, building a new relationship, having our people learn how to, deal with that vendor. So any thoughts on that? Not having to change vendors, but still saving?
What we have found is that when we bring our recommendations through to our clients, 80% of the time, our client's not changing vendors. I mean, the key here is, can I bring the market to bear on my vendors? And when I say bring to bear, you kind of have to know what the alternatives are. You can't just say, I want a decrease. They'll maybe give you a small decrease and everybody's happy, but that's not really where they can go. So the deal here is, in order to find these savings, most times you don't have to change vendors. You're really just making sure they're not overcharging you. There's no errors in your bills. You're not paying for things you don't need. So that's, we really make sure that our people know we don't need to change vendors to get a lot of these benefits. And that's really where people maybe ignore it because they think that's the only solution, and it's not.
Awesome. Another question that came in is, do you make vendor recommendations if you identify one that is more expensive than you think is appropriate for the service they provide?
Well, what we're going to do, and really what you should do yourselves, is we're going to look at the vendor marketplace and look at the entire landscape. We're going to boil it down to a few that we think are the best. Now, one thing we will never do, and you shouldn't do it either unless you think it's appropriate, is denigrate the value of the service you're getting just to get better prices. It's one thing to do that and increase your profit, but you may decrease your profit in the long term if you got a poorer level of service. So we will never recommend that. We're gonna recommend what's best for the client, and really that's the way you should be looking at it too. So it's a combination of price and service that you need to make your decision on. And yeah, we just will not denigrate the value of the service that a client's receiving already.
Awesome. Another one that came in, Dennis, was nonprofit leaders are often far too busy to really look at these things effectively. So just any thoughts on how a nonprofit specifically can stay on top of this stuff, which you kind of alluded to earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make this into a sales webinar. That wasn't the purpose. It was to teach people, what we can look at, how you can help fix your business. But, you know, it's not only, I absolutely get it with nonprofits because the resources are so thin and you just can't overhire. And so, in that case, maybe you need to look at outsourcing it to get that same benefit. And you just have to make sure there's a positive ROI because, again, like I said earlier on, every dollar that you get back goes to your bottom line, and that allows in a nonprofit to be able to deliver better services and better programs to your constituents. But the same theory holds true in businesses as well. Often too busy to really put resources into this. It's the same thing. Can I find a way? Can I outsource it and bring people on to do this and still deliver to my bottom line where I don't have to, you know, penalize my existing operations? And I know that's even a bigger challenge for nonprofits and charities. I hope that answered what was being asked.
Yeah, looks like it did. And then someone just wanted clarity, Dennis, about our services and what our contingency fee is as a percentage of the savings we find.
Yeah, what we do is we charge 50% of the savings for a 36-month period. Now, it's not just a one-time hit and run analysis, though, so I don't want anyone to think that. What we do for that is we review the bills every single month for that 36-month period. And we're doing that so we can isolate the savings that can be achieved, so that we can analyze the marketplace on an ongoing basis. We can stay on top of the vendors. We can make sure no billing errors creep in or price creep creeps in. All of that is part of what we do. And so we share in that for that 3-year period. Most of our clients renew with us because they just simply don't want to come back and start managing this stuff on their own because they got more important things to do. That's the number one, the revenue, and number two, the margin. That's what really business people manage the best. But I'm just pointing out this stuff below the margin line should be managed as well. So, okay.
Okay, those are the questions I've received.
Okay, well, I hope this was helpful to everyone. Again, I want to thank everybody for spending some time with us and going through this. I hope, again, like I said a second ago, that it was helpful to you and that you can find value in it. And anybody that needs to get more information, please feel free to reach out to us, and we will certainly see if we can help you as well. So again, thanks everybody for attending, and hopefully we'll have another webinar in the future.